When people talk about a place being an eyesore, it's usually just a way to talk about them not liking who lives there. And if you're really going to talk about a place being an eyesore, what you really need to be talking about is how it's allowed to become one. And those are stories that don't really have anything to do with the kind of people that live there.
They've been here since they were babies themselves, and they were raised here, and they raised their children. I said, yeah, but look at this place, it's deteriorating.
Being within a community where you're free, where you feel free, you can walk out your door.
I've been here approximately 32 years. Before that, I lived on the south side, around 35th Street. I come from a gang-infested area. I escaped that by going to the military. When I came back from Vietnam, I, like most other veterans, was discombobulated with society. I had post-traumatic stress and didn't know it. And I certainly wasn't happy with my surroundings, so I wanted to move. And I put in an application for CHA. And they give you 3 choices. And this was one of my 3.
My son, LaShawn, he had sickle cell anemia, and he was like 6 or 7 years old. There was always something wrong with the elevators in public house. I mean, we lived on the 8th floor. With a sickle cell, he had to walk up and down stairs to go to school. So it got to be too much, and then my husband told me, you need to contact CHA and let them know that our son is sick and that you really wanted to get into Lathrop homes. And so I talked to my son's doctors, and I told him he was out of breath and the pain was so bad coming up and down the stairs. And to the doctors wrote a letter to CHA. I came over to Lathrop Homes. I was just so happy because I don't have to live in a high-rise. And that was one of the happiest days of my life.
This development was built during the Great Depression in 1938 under the Works Progress Administration. Initially, this was an all-white public housing development. The concept was that this would be a family neighborhood for working-class people. By the 70s and 80s, this actually became probably the most racially, ethnically diverse public housing community in the city. This was not a place where just African Americans lived.
It had Hispanics, whites, blacks, and others. As I got to know my community, I could see that there was a lot of good people. I mean, a lot of tremendous people.
I really got to meet people from going to the schools and do a lot of things that you can ordinarily do in a regular community. We had a food pantry that was here in Lathrop Homes. It was one hand helps the other, or one neighbor helps the other.
And so we saw ourselves as like a mini United Nations. But our neighbors saw us as isolationists and were too afraid to travel on this side of Damon. So there was barbecues, there were backyard parties, there were dances. It was cool. And so what people thought about us on the outside, we could care less. I mean, that's how that went.
Whenever people talk about something drawing the wrong kind of activity, or where maybe the community that lives here isn't like the rest of the Lincoln Park area, these are all evaluations that are shaped by class and race prejudice and various forms of bias that people have. People talk about like crime that was an issue in the 90s, gangs who were like operating.
When I first moved over here, it was just like I never left the South Side. The gangs had a hold of Lathrop.
It's part of the narrative of any low-income community.
Didn't even know us, didn't even try to get to know us. They just saw us as I gotta be careful what I say here. Part of that reputation came because of the gangs, okay? But no one ever really took the time to get to know people on this side.
If this place became an eyesore at some point, it was because it was allowed to become an eyesore.
Over the year, damage happened to my unit, and the pipes would start rotting out and breaking loose, and then the water would come down over our stoves. Mold would start forming within our units. The management would send some maintenance people out, but it wasn't enough.
There was a snowstorm. It was a blizzard, really, and it caved the roof of my apartment building. Concave, it fell in. And since I was on the 3rd floor, my apartment was exposed.
If they were properly maintained, there are things that would have aged gracefully. The major problem and the major misconception around public housing in this country is that it's the residents who drove it into the ground. The reality is that actually the way that the financial operations of public housing were structured were such that it was impossible to maintain properties like they should have been.
It was slated to be all public housing. But then
the CHA kind of slowly rolled back on its promises of keeping this as a public housing community. And eventually, the prospect of this remaining a 100% public housing community was totally off the table.
Everything starts with a rumor that they were going to come and gentrify the area.
this is valuable land. This was a money-making opportunity.
We were upset as a congregate.
The residents at Lathrop had put up a tremendous amount of effort to fight the city, to get a seat at the table in decisions that were being made about their community.
Lathrop had LAC, which is kind of like a small governing representative for the people who live within Lathrop. They weren't doing their job as far as disseminating information. That also caused a problem. That didn't sit well with the community at large. No, fell on deaf ears. Here's where my activism comes in at.
They are proposing the city grant $17 million of TIF money to a redevelopment that will reduce the amount of public housing on the north side by 525 units.
There were tenant leaders who were very active. There were youth leaders who were very active.
We wanted to give Lathrop a voice.
They have no plans to replace our 525 units.
I mean, people would just be like cleared out with no clear sense of where to go. This eventually was not something that the residents could win, but protections for the public housing residents here are definitely in place because of the tireless advocacy of the resident leaders.
Now there is no more LAC. What happened is when management took over, they iced the LAC, which was the voice of the people for the CHA.
People were moving from like a resource-rich neighborhood, which this clearly is, to very segregated neighborhoods with way higher rates of poverty and crime and worse schools. And as you can see, with the construction still going on, the process is still ongoing.
As I sit here and talk to you now, my mission is to gather as much information as I can from management, from CHA, management builders, whatever, and get that information to the people.
The tenant organizing is a lot less visible these days because on the one hand, first of all, the communities themselves are in large part gone, and so people are dispersed throughout the city. I mean, I definitely think that it's the story of Chicago, that a place that used to house, you know, several hundred families with children, where there was lots of green space to play, and there was a daycare center and a boys and girls club, and ease of access to public transit so people could get all around the city, that a place like that used to house low-income families has now become, you know, the site of a Hex Coffee. I would say that that is a very Chicago story.